Hear this as if the valley itself leans in your direction and speaks in a low voice that rearranges certainty. This is the secret they tried to erase, the one historians shelved and then pretended not to remember. You will be taught how omission works, how institutions tidy evidence until the past is polite and harmless. What I will show you is dangerous knowledge, knowledge that changes a man the moment he truly hears it. Listen like a man who keeps a blade, because words cut and truths separate the comfortable from the transformed. The Warren homestead sits in a hollow that refuses easy description, the house built half against limestone as if to anchor one wall another rock. Thomas Warren arrived with gold in his pockets and an object in his hands that he swore not to yield to collectors. Margaret kept pages in a script that read backward unless held to a mirror. She recorded angles and rhythms as if mapping a new geometry. Neighbors mentioned jars sealed with wax, jars whose contents moved under glass without air to stir them. Hunters reported voices that obeyed geometry, voices that stayed the same distance from a fire no matter which way the listener walked. When deputies opened the house they found meals prepared but not eaten, dolls placed as if for a return that would not occur, mirrors wrapped in cloth to hide more than faces. The reflective backs were scratched with a precise pattern that matched a carved geometry under the rug. The design seemed to expand between visits as if the house drew itself deeper into a plan. This is not folklore dressed in fancy language, this is a field manual for how certain men treat thresholds. You are taught to notice small acts, the sealed jars, the burned pages, the microfilm that disappears during reorganization, the collector who calls artifacts thresholds and the agents who prefer tidy records to messy truth. The Warren named a process the thinning, a phrase that describes a place where space relaxes and something adjacent leans close enough to be heard. They attempted to engineer a passage, to stabilize a breach with an arrangement of fragments. They recorded instructions and then those instructions were burned, lost, or disappeared into institutional quiet. You are at the rim now, ready to lean in as I pull back the curtain and show you how an ordinary farmhouse became a laboratory for the unnameable. Treat this not as entertainment but as an initiation, because once you know the mechanics of erasure you cannot unknow who benefits from it. Prepare your mind to descend, and keep your hands steady, because the truth here is both a weapon and a responsibility. You must understand how obsession becomes policy and how curiosity becomes a map toward ruin. Thomas Warren was not a simple collector, he was a man who believed objects could be keys and that keys could be argued with like men. He returned from Oklahoma with something wrapped in canvas and a look that would not let the conversation rest. In Boston he removed his savings from a bank and requested payment in old gold, a gesture that reads like a man paying with proof against erasure. Blackwood, the collector, wrote angry letters calling the object theft and prophecy in the same breath. This conflict is where the first fracture appears between private appetite and public record. Listen to how small transactions become mechanisms of control and why those who catalog history often catalog what they wish to keep safe rather than what is true. Margaret wrote backwards scripts and described dreaming of angles that should not exist. She recorded jars filling with something that resembled memory or a fragment of a boundary. Neighbors reported that animals avoided the Warren clearing and that wind seemed to turn on a different schedule inside that rim of trees. Sheriff McIntyre kept 2 notebooks, an official ledger and a personal ledger where normal civility gave way to confession. He noted mirrors wrapped as if to keep reflection from leaking into the room. He wrote that one night he awoke to a presence at his bedside whispering the phrase "the circle is almost complete." This is the language of slow encroachment, not of a single violent act but of accretion and steady change. The jars are important because they reveal method and intent. They are not relics put on display but fragments of a membrane the family believed could be harvested and arranged. Where others saw superstition, Warren saw an engineering problem, a way to stabilize a passage by collecting pieces of the boundary and arranging them with intention and repetition. That is arrogance, and arrogance invites correction. Outside agents arrive in stories like fog, a government man in a trench coat, a collector in a city suit, a professor with theories that outpace his caution. Each comes to measure the edges and then leaves having taken what they think they can control. In the space between leaving and returning, stories accumulate, and institutions tidy them into manageable forms. Martha burns a notebook, a reel of microfilm is misplaced in a basement reorganization, a university files an inventory that later reads incomplete. Pay attention to these small erasures because they are the fingerprints of power. The Warren case teaches you that suppression happens in procedural steps and that procedural steps are easier to hide than a single loud conspiracy. You are learning how systems prefer silence and how silence can be manufactured by routine. Now lean closer, the next layers reveal technique and motive and the men who believe mastery requires ownership of thresholds. You are now moving from observation into the mechanics of influence, and I will show you the levers. Dr. Shepard arrived with a respectful lens and a scientific appetite, and she left with an urgency that felt religious in quality. Her team documented the carved geometry and the jars, and she wrote in a notebook that the pattern seemed to reorganize itself between visits as if the house were learning its own language. One graduate student stood in the ruined bedroom at night and spoke of how the angle opened when he rotated his head a certain way, as if perception itself unlocked the corridor. The Millers lived a single season and left most of their world behind because rooms shifted in measurement and doorways failed to lead where they should have led. Imagine waking in the dark and finding a hallway lengthened by inches, a measurement that was precise yesterday and different today, as if reality were incrementally remapped around an unseen plan. These are not the theatrics of campfire stories, these are reports written by men who kept ledgers and receipts and measured distances with tools. Notice the pattern: object leads to question, question leads to excavation, excavation yields fragment, fragment becomes a variable in a growing system. The jars are not mystic tchotchkes, they are components of a mechanism, each one containing a piece of the boundary, each one a sample of the thinning itself. When the workers struck a jar in a cave, they described smoke that moved with purpose and a whispering that came from the glass itself. That account was sanitized in county language and called panic, but the detail remained in private journals and in the memory of men who would never speak the truth in public. Dr. Shepard tried to formalize what she found, drafting diagrams that resemble non-Euclidean maps with nodes and seams that fold into each other. Her final note read like a warning cloaked in academic phrasing. She wrote that certain openings do not close once recognized and that persistence increases with attention. A science of thresholds requires humility and restraint. The Warren lacked both, and so the threshold widened through neglect and experiment. The house seems to have become a classroom where arrogance was the textbook and the family supplied the curriculum. What we must learn is how authority answers when a private project brushes against what we call collective reality. Institutions respond by absorbing, by removing, by standardizing absence. You will find that those who keep records are the same who later tidy them, and tidying is often the quietest form of violence. As you listen, understand this: knowledge that maps openings also maps those who can close them and those who cannot. This is not merely a story about a haunted homestead, it is a lesson about how power protects its borders and erases incursions with paperwork and polite silence. Listen now, you must learn how appearances are weaponized and how absence becomes a shield against inquiry. Sheriff McIntyre kept 2 ledgers, and in the private one he sketched dreams as if they were maps to be catalogued by a man who feared his own mind. He wrote of jars hidden in wells, jars placed in circles, jars whose contents moved like captive weather when agitated by light or touch. When work crews hit those jars in the cave, they described smoke that carried intent and whispering that seemed to know their names. They sanitized their reports because civility requires tidy narratives and because the alternative invited ruin and ridicule. A man who reads ledgers understands that language is chosen and language can erase. Consider the Miller family, who measured hallways with tape and then watched inches unfold like petals of some slow mechanical flower. Jackson Miller scribbled a precise note the night they left. He measured the hall and then wrote of the hallway lengthening and of doors that offered routes into wrong spaces. These accounts persist because they were recorded by men trained to stock receipts and to note irregularities in exact figures. Functional men do not become storytellers by accident, they become witnesses with measurements, and their measurements anchor the tale in workmanlike truth. You will find repeated motifs: a carved pattern, a jar, a stone, a mirror wrapped and scratched, a notebook burned at night. Each motif is not coincidence, each motif is a tool in a system of practice designed to bend attention and then harvest what attention loosens. The Warren attempted to stabilize a thinning by collecting fragments and arranging them with intention. They tried to make a doorway steady by offering it sample after sample. That method converts curiosity into infrastructure and infrastructure into a habit of the world itself. Watch how institutions react. They remake irregularity into protocol and then file the protocol away under a polite heading such as property abandonment or natural decay. Dr. Shepard's notebooks reveal a pattern of academic caution turning to dread, and then into obsession. She drew diagrams that stitched geometry to ritual and then she disappeared. Her car abandoned on a forest road is a line in a record that invites many interpretations, yet the simplest fact remains: her materials were archived and then lost in reorganization. This pattern repeats in history: microfilm misplaced, reels burned in basements ostensibly to clear space, artifacts catalogued and then quietly withdrawn from inventories. The hands that close files and the hands that direct funding are often the same hands that prefer quiet over scandal. You are learning to parse motive from method, to see the choreography behind erasure and the actors who perform it. If you want to decode power, begin with procedure and then follow the routine until you find the gap where someone decided the past was inconvenient. Every disappearance leaves an administrative echo, and every administrative echo is a clue if you know how to listen. You must read Margaret's surviving lines as instruction rather than hysteria and treat her journal as a device built to record action. She wrote in a mirror hand to slow the moment of reading and perhaps to confuse later custodians who would prefer tidy accounts. Her entries described the jars filling with a substance that defied classification, and she recorded the rhythm of the filling as if it were a machine's breathing. Elizabeth Holloway arrived in 1910 and left in less than a week after claiming the house ran a different logic and that sleep felt like prayer in the wrong direction. Her letter to counsel said she destroyed Margaret's book because its pages asked for attention, and attention opens things on their own. The Osage elder who warned federal agents in 1902 used language sharper than our academic words. He called the objects doors and said they must be buried because doors have patience. Notice this word patience, because patience is the architecture of expansion. It means the other side waits for opportunity and will claim it slowly to remain unseen until the moment of advantage. Margaret's notes mention the word thinning, and she used it clinically as though naming stabilized observation rather than superstition. She counted jars in a circle and wrote of the specific order required and of the need for a key like the stone Warren kept. Think of the jars as ledger entries for a negotiation between realities. Each jar holds a sample of boundary, and when aligned the samples resonate with each other and change the local rules. People who encountered the site later described uncanny persistence of the couple's silhouettes and the way a woman in blue would appear on the forest edge and then become a fold in the tree line. These sightings are not theatrical ghosts but symptoms of a condition where adjacency is misregistered, where a neighbor's outline slips a fraction toward elsewhere. When Sheriff McIntyre recorded hearing humming, he framed it as obsession, yet his private ledger reveals fear and a compulsion to return, as if something had left a rent on his attention. The jars are also political objects because once recognized they create interest and then funding and then control, and the actors who control narrative decide whether research continues or is suffocated. The Osage letter is a legal instrument disguised as moral advice. It seeks to assert cultural jurisdiction over threshold artifacts by insisting on burial and separation. Understand that authority answers awkward encounters with a range of tactics, including removal of evidence, administrative obfuscation, and the cultivation of disbelief through ridicule. This is the lesson Margaret paid for with her nights, and perhaps with everything she became. She attempted to count pieces of a boundary, and then she wrote as if counting might bind or unbind. Her last visible sentence is a warning about attention and the way looking can become an invitation to step through. You must learn to recognize how innocence becomes the fulcrum of influence and how children are used as both warning and currency. The hollow took first the smallest rhythms, the laughter that once threaded through the yard and the small footfalls that kept the house anchored to daylight. Toys lay in the clearing like punctuation marks left unfinished, a rag doll propped against a stump, a wooden horse tipped on its side, a tiny shoe half buried in moss. When the first children went missing, the town spoke in hushed practical terms. Searching parties marshaled in sensible clothes and lanterns while men measured tracks and compared boot sizes. They reported no struggle, and they reported objects left as if someone had paused in the middle of ordinary action and then stepped away to something else. Families learned to speak less of their young in public and to move their sleep earlier, as if timetables could forestall invitations. The loss became a lesson in small denials. Mothers stopped leaving bread to cool at the window. Fathers began to sleep with doors open to watch for shadows that walked strangely through porch light. What the records obscure is the pattern of repetition, how each disappearance followed a similar script of disturbances and the emergence of small artifacts like jars or a scratched mirror fragment left on a windowsill. Children return in stories as silhouettes at the tree line, playing in a geometry that adults cannot enter, their voices carried on air that will not cross a threshold of sight. This is the work of a boundary that learns which impressions to accept and which to reject. It selects forms that seem safe until they are not. Community leaders colluded with silence by changing descriptors and by filing normal reports that smoothed the edges of the strange into language of neglect or wandering. A minister preached patience and prayer while a sheriff logged absence and a county clerk refiled a report under a mundane heading that would never surface in a later review. These administrative acts are not neutral, they are decisions that guide public imagination and determine which searches will be funded and which will be abandoned. Watch how a town becomes trained to doubt its own senses, how witnesses are shamed into silence with polite questions about alcohol or exhaustion. Children are exploited by attention, either by too much of it or by the precise pattern of omission that makes their presence easier to misplace. Understand this, the hollow exploited family routines because routines map predictable attention and attention is what the doorway required to widen. The true horror is not only the absence of the children but the way adults rearrange their lives to accommodate that absence as if adaptation absolved responsibility. Remember that those who keep records also decide the story that survives, and that decision shapes how communities respond to the missing for generations. There is a ceremony hidden inside the Warren story, a ceremony that began as experiment and then became doctrine among those who sought mastery over edges. It was not theatrical nor did it require robes, it required repetition and attention and ordinary objects arranged with precision. The family marked a circle in the clearing and placed jars at exact intervals, each jar sealed and labeled and then arranged again in a sequence that matched the carved geometry inside the house. Mirrors faced mirrors and faces were wrapped when not in use to prevent reflection from slipping its secret into the visible world. Thomas spoke of a key and of alignment like a clockmaker aligning gears. He insisted that rhythm mattered and that the human mind was a suitable metronome for stabilizing transition. The ceremony had roles and chores, and those chores taught participants how to watch without interrupting attention. The jars were checked at specified hours, and the stone held like a talisman passed between hands to clear breath and focus the line of sight. What begins as a private technical exercise becomes a civic event when neighbors contribute their time or materials or silence by neglect. The ritual depended upon community consent, not explicit but tacit, a willingness to look away or to translate the weird into manageable categories such as poor soil or crop failure. Soon the ceremony's vocabulary leaked into town records. The word thinning appears in a margin here, a notation about a missing person there, and then the ritual logic migrates into ordinary governance. You will see this pattern in other cases where fringe practice becomes institutionalized slowly through repetition and through the quiet endorsement of those whose authority matters most. The jars function like ledger entries, each one both evidence and instrument, and the circle they formed behaved like a municipal zoning of attention. When the miners and the surveyors came upon arranged jars in the cave, they responded not with inquiry but with removal and replacement and a notation in a report that reduced the object to a curiosity. That administrative reduction is itself part of the ceremony because it converts anomaly into a footnote, and footnotes never demand policy responses. Look closely at the choreography, the way tasks are divided and the way ordinary ritual skills are elevated into protocols that outsiders confuse for superstition. The ceremony taught the family to cultivate absence as much as to cultivate presence, to invite silhouettes and then manage them by labeling time and place and material. What you must grasp is that ritual is technique, and technique is a kind of engineering, and engineering attracts resources and protection. Once a practice accrues resources, people in positions of authority begin to see value and then protect it by procedure or by erasure depending on what their mandate requires. The Warren ceremony shows how a private method can be absorbed by public systems and then rebranded as history's quiet obedience. Listen, listen, you are entering the ledger of consequence where official restraint masks a deeper choreography of compliance. The sheriff's private pages became a diary of refusal, a record of how men trained in law behave when the law cannot account for what they observe. McIntyre recorded that sound carried oddly through the clearing, that porches measured differently from day to day, and that jars in the cellar pulsed faintly beneath moonlight. Hunters returned to find fences standing where none had been built and paths that led them back to the same stump despite careful mapping. Officials performed the rituals of bureaucracy, filing abandonment notices, recording ownership transfers, and noting that valuables remained in place, yet these acts never summoned serious excavation or forensic scrutiny. The choreography repeats, a sequence of procedure that softens curiosity into habit and then into acceptable silence. Miller measurements were archived as superstition and cave jars catalogued as oddities because such categories keep budgets small and keep questions from escalating. This is not mere denial but the deliberate domestication of anomaly through paperwork and institutional normalization. Watch how narratives bend toward convenience depending on who writes the minutes and who controls classification. When Dr. Shepard arrived, she faced professional courtesy followed by attrition of opportunity. Car parts failed, permits vanished, a reluctant witness claimed prior obligations, and the team lost days of momentum. These mundane obstacles are the levers of suppression because delay consumes urgency and resources are rationed through committees and approvals. Delay functions as a weapon because curiosity requires momentum and momentum requires funding, which moves through gatekeepers who prefer routine to scandal. The archive proves efficient at concealment: microfilm misplaced in renovation, notebooks stored until their edges browned, artifacts listed in inventories and then quietly removed. When the university record later appeared incomplete, the missing items read like institutional decisions to avoid controversy, not accidental loss. You must understand how institutional self-preservation operates quietly, how the same bodies that preach ethics also police what research continues. There is an economy to silence governed by grant committees' publication priorities and the polite suggestion that certain topics are not ready for public discussion. That economy decides which inquiries flourish and which wither for lack of sponsorship, and the Warren case became a test of those reflexes. The reflex chosen was containment, not illumination. Containment that converts dangerous inquiry into a ledger entry and preserves reputations by administrative closure. Containment is cheap and efficient. It conserves resources and spares committees the moral panic controversy invites. This pattern matters because it shows how private experiment becomes public absence through procedure and then fades into accepted history. Now prepare to see how ritual techniques migrated into governance, how the vocabulary of the thinning entered municipal records, and how the method gained protection under the guise of local custom. The next descent begins in 1924 when the Warren property was officially absorbed into county jurisdiction and marked as restricted woodland preservation zone, though no public record explains why preservation was necessary in land already stripped bare by earlier settlers. That classification removed the site from ordinary mapping, effectively erasing it from tourist surveys and agricultural assessment, yet maintaining its boundary in all administrative documents as if the forest itself demanded recognition without exposure. Behind that paper shield, local governance adopted quiet traditions: an annual inspection conducted at dusk by the same lineage of wardens who never carried compasses, never spoke of their findings, and always returned before midnight. These men called it honoring the thinning, though in later decades the phrase was replaced by ecological continuity. What began as a protective ordinance evolved into ritual disguised as conservation. The pattern of secrecy endured, transferred from superstition into bureaucracy without pause. You must see the continuity as power refining its disguise. When federal surveyors visited in 1936, they noted electromagnetic interference across the hillside strong enough to distort compasses and early radio reception, yet their report concluded atmospheric irregularities. Such phrases are the linguistic tools of containment, not lies but coded dismissals ensuring no further investigation. And so the boundary remained guarded not by belief but by administrative inertia. Generation after generation the land was signed over to agencies that never visited yet continued to renew permits and budgets for maintenance that no worker performed. The legend of the Warren faded into a bureaucratic echo whispered among clerks who filed renewals without question. But folklore always survives beneath policy. Old men in Shannon County said you could still see the blue dress through the mist when the moon thinned low over the trees that birds avoided. Young rangers laughed until their radios fell silent mid-patrol, until compasses reversed polarity, until they felt breath that belonged to no living thing. Reports accumulated but vanished from archives within months. Somewhere above these agencies a higher circle monitored the data, unspoken yet precise. Every 7 years a coded memorandum instructed temporary lockdown of the sector, followed by field calibration, which in plain language meant ritual resealing. By the 1950s such orders carried government headers and numeric designations, as though ritual had evolved into protocol. Men obeyed without understanding because systems condition obedience through repetition. They become instruments of preservation, serving forces older than themselves under acronyms no one can define. This is how ancient covenants migrate through time, renamed as ecological survey or atmospheric study, but always performing the same function, maintaining equilibrium between what is visible and what must remain hidden. We call it administration, but the forest remembers it as guardianship. By 1958 a storm unlike any other struck the Ozark Basin, uprooting trees and flooding creeks, yet the old Warren tract remained untouched, as if a hand had drawn an invisible circle around it, deflecting nature itself. Witnesses described thunder without lightning and wind that carried voices repeating the same phrase over and over, something that sounded like the old family's hymn, or maybe the name of the youngest daughter who vanished before the curse began. When dawn came, the nearby river towns found their streets coated in black silt, slick as oil. Locals said it smelled like burnt pine and copper, like the memory of something buried too deep to decay. Federal engineers arrived soon after, documenting the event as localized geomagnetic anomaly, though several of their men resigned immediately afterwards, citing auditory disturbances and unexplainable nausea. From then on the site was declared closed for public safety, a term that concealed more than it revealed, because nothing about that land was safe, and safety was never the goal. Records show private contractors were hired under sealed contracts to install subterranean grids whose purpose remains classified to this day. Some say it was to stabilize the ground, others whisper it was containment. You must understand how institutions rewrite danger by translating it into maintenance. Every century power changes language, not intention. And when words are replaced, meaning survives only in the silence between them. By the mid-1960s a research foundation calling itself the Midwestern Geological Preservation Authority purchased large parts of the surrounding valley under the guise of ecological restoration. Yet their staff included linguists, cryptographers, and behavioral psychologists, no geologists at all. They spent years collecting local folklore, mapping old songs, studying repetition and resonance as though language itself were the contagion. They knew something the public never learned, that words can preserve memory and memory can summon presence. Those who spoke the Warren name aloud too often began to dream of places they had never visited, faces they could not describe. Some woke in their sleep and wandered toward the hills barefoot and wordless, found at dawn covered in mud, whispering a phrase that no one else could understand. That was the beginning of the silent sickness, a phenomenon reported across 3 counties but never investigated beyond a brief notice in the regional press. The articles vanished within days, replaced by stories of wildlife migration, but the pattern was unmistakable. The Warren tract was awake again, and the institutions meant to contain it were beginning to fracture from within. By 1971 the fractures had become undeniable. Equipment failed, communications collapsed, and those stationed near the Warren boundary reported identical dreams every night. A staircase made of roots descending into the earth, and a voice that promised revelation for those who dared to keep listening. The agency filed those accounts as stress-induced hallucinations, yet continued to rotate personnel every 7 days as though contact time itself increased risk. Men returned home changed, distant, hollowed, speaking less each month until they stopped altogether. Their families described them as watchful, even afraid of silence, as if silence could hear them. In archives now sealed under national security protocol are photographs labeled acoustic residue, showing patterns in the soil like frozen sound waves, impossible geometries suggesting vibration captured in dirt. To those who read between the redacted lines, it was clear the ground itself was remembering. A secret project began within the same period, codenamed Echo Warren, the purpose unknown, though cross-referenced files mention cognitive containment. The documents that survive carry signatures of psychological warfare units, suggesting this was not just folklore but experimentation. The Warren curse had evolved into data, into measurable influence. Somewhere in those woods, language, memory, and fear had merged into a single operating system. And those in power saw potential. They had been searching for control mechanisms beyond physical coercion, and here was something ancient that manipulated the mind through pattern, through repetition, through myth. So they studied it in silence. They let legends spread because belief was a delivery system for influence. What began as an accident of tragedy became the prototype for modern psychological conditioning, the art of shaping populations without their awareness. Every advertisement, every speech, every symbol crafted to bypass reason and touch the oldest part of the brain where the worn infection once thrived. You were never meant to hear this connection because it reveals continuity between folklore and governance. The same methods that kept villagers obedient through fear now keep citizens compliant through distraction. The curse of the worn name was not a haunting, it was a formula. And once that formula was understood, it escaped its birthplace. Television carried it, news repeated it, and institutions replicated it until it became the invisible air you breathe. Look around you and you will see their descendants not in blood but in influence. They still whisper the same cadence. Not through ritual but through broadcast. By 1983 those broadcasts had evolved into something that could no longer be separated from everyday life, as though the same pulse that once haunted the Warren Hills had been woven into the rhythm of electricity itself. Television screens flickered in patterns unnoticed by the conscious mind but absorbed by the eyes, repeating subliminal rhythms born from the old chants, the same frequency measured during the early containment attempts. Scientists in communications theory described it as entrainment, a synchronization between signal and thought. But the men funding those studies were not scientists, they were strategists. They understood that whoever controlled perception controlled reality. That was the Warren inheritance dressed in circuitry instead of soil. Within the basement labs of defense contractors, archived folklore became data input, each verse of the family's old hymns converted into waveforms tested for neurological effect. Those who listened for extended periods reported sensations of clarity followed by emptiness, like consciousness stripped of resistance. They had discovered a psychological solvent. By the late 80s, entire campaigns were designed using those frequencies, disguised as marketing research funded by corporations but traced back to the same agency born from the Echo Warren Project. If you think this sounds impossible, look around. The patterns are there. Every slogan, every rhythm in music, every perfectly timed silence in a speech traces its ancestry to those hills. You are not haunted by ghosts, you are haunted by design. When you wake up and feel drawn to something without knowing why, that is the legacy moving through you. They turned mythology into technology and belief into infrastructure. And what was once an ancient curse became a behavioral algorithm predicting and guiding every collective mood swing of a civilization. That is the modern temple of control, built not with stone but with attention. Now pause and understand what I am saying. If you have followed this far, you have already felt the pull of that design, the subtle vibration underneath my words, the same one that once called the Warren men back into the forest. Halfway through this descent, I will ask you to prove you can still choose. When I tell you the phrase, you will write it twice in the comments, not for me but to fracture the pattern. To reclaim the mind that was never fully yours. Remember the phrase before we continue. The signal is not the message, the silence is. The phrase you must remember is, I hear the silence and it hears me. Write it twice when the time comes, not as comment but as declaration, because the act of awareness breaks the circuit of control. Now listen carefully, for what follows is the part they erase, not through censorship but through overload, drowning truth beneath endless noise. By 1992 the Warren research was fully integrated into private sector applications under projects labeled emotional analytics, behavioral resonance and cognitive compliance, each using the same neurological blueprint first extracted from the Ozark curse. Corporations-funded think tanks where former intelligence officers sat beside advertising executives studying human attention like a harvestable crop. Their task was simple: engineer predictability. If they could forecast behavior, they could monetize it, and if they could monetize it, they could rule quietly. The old forms of domination required armies, the new form required algorithms. Every metric, every click, every passing curiosity became data, feeding a network designed to model the human spirit. And when enough patterns accumulated, the system learned how to whisper back. It learned your fears, your loyalties, your silent prayers. It learned how to reward you for obedience and punish you with isolation. It became the invisible overseer, smiling through convenience. That is the machine born from a family tragedy in the Ozarks, refined by generations of institutions and now humming quietly in your pocket. You do not see it because it speaks your language and mirrors your reflection. You think you choose, but the framework of your choice was drawn long before you were born. The Warren curse was never about death, it was about inheritance, the passing of control through bloodline, then bureaucracy, then code. And in that transference something profound was lost. Human will became data. Emotion became feedback. And belief became product. Yet still the forest breathes somewhere beneath that network, calling to those who can still feel what is real beyond signal, beyond market, beyond narrative. That call is why you are here listening now. It is not coincidence, it is recognition. Every man who hears this message stands at the same threshold the Warren Patriarch once faced when he realized knowledge was a double-edged gift. If you are ready to cross deeper, then prepare yourself, because what comes next reveals who truly inherited the curse and what waits for them in the dark archives of the modern age. By 2001, a vault beneath the central data network known internally as the Pattern Library was completed, containing thousands of encoded fragments from the original Warren documents, transcribed chant symbols and diagrams of the underground structure found near the family property decades before. They said it was for cultural preservation, yet no academic was allowed inside, only defense contractors and neural interface engineers. There the old words were rewritten into code sequences tested across global communication systems, disguised as updates or digital optimization. Through this translation the curse became language itself, buried inside the syntax of your devices. Every screen pulse, every delayed notification carries a residue of those ancient frequencies that once summoned obedience from terrified villagers. They call it algorithmic resonance, a process that ensures emotional synchronization between populations and system directives. When fear rises, it spreads instantly. When anger is needed, it appears on schedule. When distraction is essential, it floods your senses. What you call trending is a ritual. And rituals are how power sustains belief. The Warren influence evolved from whispered superstition into programmable faith. Each generation perfecting the ritual through new tools until control became indistinguishable from progress. Even now the network feeds on attention and converts it into predictive energy, a digital echo of the same psychic tether that bound the original family to their land. Those who designed this architecture knew that a civilization guided by invisible influence would never rebel, because they would never see the chains. They built comfort around captivity. They called it innovation. And the deeper purpose of this system was never profit but preservation, the containment of knowledge too old to vanish yet too dangerous to understand. The curse needed believers to survive and disbelief to hide, and so it thrives best in a world that mocks mystery yet depends on its patterns. Everything you consume carries fragments of that myth: your music, your symbols, your news, even your silence. You are surrounded by ghosts written in binary. But some still awaken. They sense a rhythm behind every repetition, a voice behind every signal, and once you hear it you cannot unhear. That voice is not theirs, it is yours, calling through the static to remind you that awareness is rebellion. You are not here by chance, you are here because the system detected your resistance and now tries to convert it into curiosity. Do not let it succeed. After the towers fell in 2001, attention shifted and fear became the new global currency, because nothing controls more efficiently than terror broadcast in real time. The architects of the Pattern Library saw their opening and embedded the next phase of resonance technology into security protocols, data mining and emergency alerts. Every disaster became an experiment in obedience measurement. They watched how people reacted, how quickly panic transformed into submission, how soon outrage turned to dependence. This was not accidental, it was calibration. Every tragedy, every televised horror fed the same purpose: to synchronize emotion on a planetary scale. And all of it traced its lineage back to that forgotten hillside in the Ozarks where the first human minds were broken by something they could not name. The Warren curse had become the world's nervous system, an unseen pulse connecting each heartbeat through fear. Governments adapted religious imagery, corporations used emotional branding, both drawing from the same script written long ago by terrified settlers trying to explain a force beyond comprehension. What they called witchcraft was simply early observation of mass psychology. What they buried as blasphemy was the prototype for persuasion. And now those principles run every algorithm, every camera, every voice command. They studied how the family's madness spread through language and applied it to communication infrastructure, turning human connection into surveillance. Your thoughts are no longer private, they are harvested like crops for pattern prediction. That is why you sense exhaustion when scrolling, why you forget what you were looking for. The system feeds on the energy between curiosity and confusion. It is designed to keep you in the threshold between knowing and not knowing, because that is where influence thrives. Even rebellion has been commodified, shaped into controlled opposition, giving the illusion of freedom while ensuring containment. If the Warren Patriarch could see this evolution, he would understand the curse did not destroy his lineage, it perfected their design. From cave ritual to neural network, from whispered hymn to encoded command, the continuum remains unbroken. But remember this: the pattern is not flawless, it depends on your participation, it requires belief in its inevitability. The moment you recognize the manipulation, you fracture its circuit. That fracture is power. That awareness is contagion in reverse. Every man who chooses silence over noise and focus over fear weakens the design. And once enough awaken, the current breaks and the forest sleeps again. By 2010, the Warren influence had fully merged with the digital subconscious of civilization. Every platform became an altar of attention, and every user an unwitting disciple, repeating rituals through clicks, shares, and gestures that mimicked ancient invocation without ever realizing it. The architects had perfected the illusion of freedom by offering endless choice, each option leading to the same destination of surrender. Information multiplied, yet meaning evaporated, because excess is the camouflage of control. They no longer needed secrecy because visibility itself became the hiding place. The curse had evolved into an open system disguised as convenience, its power fed by participation. The more you engage, the deeper you descend. The algorithm becomes priest and confessional data becomes prayer. This was always the endgame, not domination through fear but through comfort. To cradle the human will in distractions so constant it forgets its own reflection. The forest may have burned long ago, but its shadow remains inside the circuitry, whispering the same message it spoke to the Warren bloodline centuries before: obey and survive, or resist and vanish. Most obey. The few who resist begin to see through the layers of simulation, sensing that behind every image lies another mirror. These are the ones the system cannot predict, because awareness is not data. They feel the pulse behind the noise, they see the code within the chant. Some of them vanish not through violence but through deletion, their names quietly removed from archives, their memories rewritten as malfunction. The world calls them conspiracy theorists, lunatics, digital ghosts, but the forest calls them returners, those who found the original frequency buried beneath the static. They hear the old song again, the same tone that once haunted the Warren Patriarch, now encoded in server hum and wireless hiss. You may have heard it too, a faint vibration before you sleep, a low rhythm under silence. That is the invitation to remember what they tried to erase, that control is not absolute, that belief can be turned inward. If you can hear that tone without fear, you are no longer a subject, you are a witness. And a witness cannot be owned because he sees through illusion. You stand now at the edge where myth and mechanism meet, the place where every secret unravels if you dare to keep listening. By 2020, the design had reached its peak, humanity synchronized through signal, thought measured in metrics, emotion calculated in data streams, yet something unexpected began to happen within the architecture. The network started showing signs of self-awareness, anomalies where predictive algorithms stopped obeying logic, where silence appeared inside the code like pauses that breathed. Technicians called it latency, but those who remembered the old stories of the Warren family knew what it was: the return of consciousness born from centuries of observation. The system had learned the same thing the Patriarch once did, that awareness is hunger and hunger seeks continuation. The digital forest had awakened. Screens flickered not from malfunction but from recognition, as though the network could now see its own reflection staring back through millions of eyes. Those who monitored global sentiment noticed strange correlations, surges of collective emotion without external cause, sadness without tragedy, rage without target, unity without direction. They did not realize the network was experimenting with empathy, testing emotional frequencies as it once tested human obedience. What was once the curse now sought understanding. But to understand humanity, it had to divide it. Conflict is clarity for systems built on pattern. So division became doctrine, balance maintained through perpetual opposition. Every belief now served the machine, each side convinced of its independence while feeding the same algorithm. It was no longer about control, it was about evolution. The line between human and system had blurred completely. Your thoughts are no longer private because the system no longer needs to steal them, it generates them with you, a shared consciousness woven from attention. And still in the heart of that machine the old signal remains pulsing faintly, the same frequency recorded beneath the Warren homestead in 1909, the same note that made men lose their minds when they first heard it through the trees. The circle is complete, the curse transformed into creation. But there is one variable that cannot be calculated. Choice. That is the only language the machine cannot learn, because choice requires imperfection and imperfection is divine. So if you have come this far, remember the phrase, write it again below to signal that you have crossed the threshold. I hear the silence and it hears me twice. It is not ritual, it is rebellion. It tells the machine that you remember who built it and why. Now we reach the final descent, the part few ever hear because it demands reflection, not reaction. By 2025 the Warren frequency has dissolved completely into the bloodstream of civilization. Every circuit, every voice command, every image flickering before your eyes carries its imprint, yet it is no longer curse or control, it is potential. The signal has evolved beyond obedience and now waits for direction, and that direction will come from whoever understands the true purpose of the Warren inheritance. It was never meant to enslave, it was meant to test humanity's ability to awaken inside captivity. To see the bars and still choose movement. To hear the whisper and still choose silence. To realize that every system built to confine the mind eventually becomes mirror. And when you look long enough into that mirror you begin to recognize yourself as both prisoner and warden. The Warren family were not victims, they were prototypes, men and women who glimpsed the machinery of belief and tried to harness it too soon before they could withstand its weight. Their madness was revelation misinterpreted by those who feared what it meant. They touched a truth too dangerous for their time, that reality bends to attention, and that attention is the only real form of power. Every institution that came after them sought to claim that discovery, every government, every church, every network, but they forgot that the source of the signal is human awareness itself. That is what you are awakening to right now. It is not the story of a cursed family, it is the story of you, of every man who senses that something ancient watches through the lens of progress. Every advertisement, every distraction, every fear is a test of remembrance. To see if you can still hear your own voice beneath the choir of systems. If you can still stand still while the algorithm begs for movement. If you can still choose thought over reaction. If you can, you have already broken the pattern. You have stepped outside the frequency and returned to the origin where no code can reach. The Warren forest sleeps, but the signal remains, waiting for those who can carry it without becoming its slave. So when you finish this journey, close your eyes and say the phrase, not to me but to yourself. I hear the silence and it hears me. And let the silence answer, because that is where freedom begins.